The lobby smelled of lemon cleaner and cold metal. A pager beeped, the sound thin and precise like a metronome. Marcus Reed tightened his grip on the broom handle, feeling the wood warm under his palm, and for a second everything else blurred into the rhythm of the sweep. A little girl sat on the marble floor near the fountain, knees pulled to her chest, fingers tracing tiny circles on the stone that left wet prints like miniature moons. People in suits passed by in rehearsed silence, shoes whispering, phones pressed to ears, voices reduced to background static. Someone said out of the corner of a conversation, "She is having another episode." The air tasted faintly of antiseptic and coffee, two smells of different urgencies colliding. Marcus set down the broom as if folding a flag and walked toward the child. Marcus moved slowly because he had learned that haste tightened the threads that bound people to their routines. He crouched without thinking about the marble cooling his knees, and when he smiled, it was not the kind of smile that tried to fix anything. He only offered a small plastic container from his janitor cart, a toy he kept for the kids who sometimes came through the lobby with parents who rushed. He blew a bubble, watching the soapy sphere tether itself to the light and wobble. The girl paused her tracing. The bubble hung between them, blue reflecting the glass panels and the high ceiling like a borrowed sky. From the mezzanine, an impeccably dressed woman watched with a mouth that had learned how to be unreadable. She descended the stairs with the measured gravity of someone who had learned how to order rooms. "Who are you?" she asked. Marcus looked up, calm, as if he had been waiting for the question his whole life. "I am Marcus," he said. "I am cleaning." When he blew another bubble, and the girl reached, something unseen softened. Minutes later, the woman in the tailored coat invited him to her office, a motion like sliding open a door the way people open agreements. "I want you to come back," she said. "Our schedules do not allow for improvisation." Marcus shrugged, still with soap on his lips. "I do small things," he said. "Small things work." Always begin with blue, he thought. Blue lets you breathe. Marcus Reed was a janitor by title and by day, and a single father by everything else. He lived above a laundromat 2 blocks from the corporate tower, in an apartment that smelled of detergent and crayons, where his 8-year-old son, Jonah, liked to line up toy cars behind a high chair like an honor guard. Marcus had once trained to be an electrician, a trade that taught him to value circuits and the patience of waiting for a problem to reveal itself. He had been laid off after the factory closed the year Jonah was born, a loss that rearranged their calendars into smaller, honest clocks. The day Jonah came home from the hospital, Marcus slept with one hand on his son so he would not forget the weight of responsibility. He learned to braid hair in the morning because it made the days shorter for Jonah. There were nights Marcus counted invoices while Jonah read stories aloud from a phone. And there were Saturdays when Marcus taught Jonah to sweep and to notice things that were easy to miss, like a bird feather by the stoop or the way light pooled in the sink at dusk. He had learned to make space for quiet because Jonah had sensory needs that made loud noises like knives, and Marcus had become fluent in the language of lowering volume and dimming lights. His backstory was a map of small decisions stitched in the margins of necessity. He had once been engaged to a woman who wanted a different kind of safety, and their separation taught him that love had more than one grammar. Marcus carried that history lightly, but it colored his choices. He had pockets full of receipts and promises. He held on to a photograph of Jonah covered in paint and grinning because it reminded him why he sheltered the slow gestures of repair and why he would sit on cold marble and blow bubbles for a stranger's daughter if that was what the moment asked of him. The woman who had watched from the mezzanine was Victoria Hale, founder and CEO of Hale Biopharmaceuticals, a company whose logo gleamed on the elevator doors and whose decisions altered neighborhoods. Victoria moved through rooms like a ship through fog, efficient at removing obstacles and leaving only outcomes she had priced. She had a Labrador named Pearl, who slept on a rug the color of oat milk, and a calendar that mapped rescue plans and investments in neat blocks. That afternoon she had come to the lobby to pick up paperwork and to tell herself, for reasons she could not name aloud, that she would not let a small errand become the story that interrupted her plans. She saw a girl humming under her breath like a song someone had practiced in secret. She saw Marcus crouched with a soap bubble, and she found herself unsure where the algebra of power met the delicate physics of mercy. Her assistant, Thomas Briggs, was waiting by the elevator with a folder the size of an expectation. Elena Park, head of public relations, had already drafted a statement in the event the episode needed a frictionless spin. Robert Chen of legal hovered nearby, as did Sarah Alvarez, the director of corporate social responsibility, who had been pushing for community outreach as if it were a colony of new beginnings. Security guard Derek blew his whistle into the pocket of his uniform and watched the interaction like a referee waiting for the foul. All of them were present and distant, the bowed heads of institutions cataloging a human moment. The first session at Victoria's request was awkward in the clean geometry of her office, sunlight slicing the room into bars. The girl, Mia Hale, had hair that caught the light in thin copper threads and eyes that darted like minnows underwater. She had been diagnosed with an autism spectrum condition at age 4, and for 2 years she had rarely spoken in public spaces. Victoria had tried therapies that arrived in the language of protocols and expensive equipment, yet Mia's small rituals had not surrendered. Marcus was at the desk with the smell of lemon on his sleeves and a small plastic jar of bubbles in his jacket pocket, as if the tool had an inner life. The office smelled of polished wood, perfume, and coffee, a triad that could be both armor and invitation. Marcus did not make promises. He arranged a blanket on the floor and sat cross-legged, ankles bony against the rug. He began to whistle softly, a tune from a childhood Sunday that Jonah hummed back at home sometimes. Mia watched his hands instead of his mouth. He taught Jonah to keep his voice at the level of a secret, and used the same tone now, the sound of an old song someone had left in the pocket of a coat. He said nothing of methods. He said, "Do you like blue?" and then rolled a marble-sized bubble toward her. The bubble shone with a blue that was not quite paint and not quite sky. Mia reached, and the action was simple and enormous. In that room, the exchange of language and silence was immediate and intimate. Dialogues unfolded with the measured cadence of discovery. Victoria asked a question with the authority of a founder used to commanding markets. "What is your training?" she said, voice even, like a ledger entry. Marcus replied, "I clean, ma'am. I listen." Elena interjected with a carefully neutral curiosity. "Do you have a program, a methodology?" Marcus smiled and said, "I have small things. They are patient." Thomas leaned forward. "We need measurable outcomes, Mr. Reed." Marcus shrugged. "You can measure when someone breathes easier." Robert Chen cleared his throat. "We need documentation, insurance compliance." Marcus looked at Mia, then at Victoria, and the room quieted like a sea before the tide breaks. "You cannot put a number on a hand being held," he said. Jonah's face flashed in Marcus's memory, and he thought of nights rocking and waiting for breathing to settle. The conversation continued in a series of exchanges that layered observation, skepticism, warmth, and protocol. In total, there were more than a dozen turns as the group tried to tether human unpredictability to corporate timelines. The sensory details in the office multiplied the scene into lived textures. The sunlight tasted of dust in the corners. The rug's weave whispered under knees. The coffee was tarry and strong. Mia's breath smelled faintly of grape, and the bubble popped with a tiny, decisive sound. In the days that followed, Marcus came back to the tower under the pretext of emptying trash and polishing glass. He learned the routes the delivery men took, where the plantings hid small creatures in the morning dew, and how the air conditioning changed across floors. He watched Mia from a considered distance. He played simple games that avoided instructions and focused on presence. He sat on the floor and let her lead, making space for her rituals. He noticed, in the small whisper of a foot, the way she would tap once before touching something, and the way her fingers hesitated, like a question hovering before an answer. He learned how to bring snacks in ways that were invitations rather than tests. Marcus cooked a peanut butter sandwich into a shape of a little sail because Jonah loved boats, and he saw how a familiar shape could invite trust. He listened to the electric hum of the building and matched his breaths to it. He made sure to always wear the same worn jacket so that his presence would be a constant. And slowly, Mia began to place her hands into Marcus's hands for comfort. Marcus taught Jonah to fold paper birds to deliver across rooms like small ambassadors. Small, consistent gestures began to lower the walls around the child. At 30% into the unfolding story, there was a moment that asked the audience to step forward. Mia painted with a blue crayon a small, careful circle on a sheet of paper, and then turned the paper to Marcus as if to offer a map. The circle was imperfect and shining in a way that had nothing to do with skill and everything to do with permission. Marcus held the sheet between his palms and breathed, seeing in that blue the same sky he had shown Jonah on nights when they counted planes. If this memory strikes you, we want to know a color that makes you feel at home. Write only the word in the comments below. The production team reads them all, and sometimes they help choose the details of the next story. Let that simplicity be part of how we build a community. The first breakthrough happened quietly beside the kitchen table in Victoria's penthouse. Marcus had been invited to a family dinner, a condition inserted by a director who thought that domestic exposure could be controlled in a schedule. That night, Victoria had tried to keep the conversation neat, moving through topics like a person moving chess pieces. Jonah was present and sat across from Mia with a shy smile. The table smelled of roasted carrots and warm bread, and the light from the pendant lamp seemed to pool around the center like a secret. Conversation flowed and halted in honest unevenness. Jonah offered Mia a folded paper bird, and she watched its shadow cross the table. There was a small moment when Mia touched the bird and then touched Jonah's hand. The physical connection was minimal but seismic in its implications. The room's air seemed to change from corporate cool to familial warmth, as if someone had opened a window and let in a different kind of weather. Victoria watched, something loosening in her chest. "Thank you," she said to Marcus later, in a voice that had lost the armor of a boardroom. Marcus shrugged. "It was blue," he said. "She likes blue." The dinner did more than nourish. It rewired how people imagined family and assistance might intersect. It also offered a quiet critique of the systems Victoria had navigated for years, a revelation that not every solution arrived in a white lab coat. But institutions were never designed only for small revelations. The board became a chorus of cautions. Elena drafted memos. Robert urged restraint. Thomas suggested a pilot program with metrics, timelines, and deliverables. Sarah worried that a mistake could be in the press and threaten investor confidence. News of the CEO allowing a janitor into the family circle leaked in a way that turned a private success into public scrutiny. A PR representative from Hale called a meeting where language was chosen with the same meticulousness a surgeon uses to map incisions. "We cannot be seen to take advice from staff not credentialed," Elena said, tapping a pen on a notebook. "This is about brand integrity," Thomas added. Marcus found himself on email chains and in meetings where everyone used the word protocol as if appeasing it would keep their world from cracking. There were texts from an anxious nanny and a whispered conversation in the hallway where a staffer hinted at lawsuits. The sensation in the company shifted from a soft afterglow to a tightening accusation like fog closing. Victoria, who had privileged instincts for both hunches and hedge, felt the tug of public expectation. She had to answer to investors and to a public that assumed control belonged only to those with titles. The tension rippled through the building like an alarm. The midpoint came when the company paused Marcus's access, pending a review. A suit from legal arrived at his locker like a winter letter. He received a formal note that his presence around the family needed to be assessed. For Marcus, this felt like a breach, not of his job, but of the small covenant he had with Mia and with Jonah. He found himself sitting on the stairwell after a shift, the smell of lemon gone, replaced by the nocturnal concrete smell of the stairwell, and he held his head in his hands. Jonah called from home, worried, and Marcus could not explain corporate worlds to an 8-year-old. He thought of the bubbles, of the paper bird, and of the way Mia had traced blue circles on a paper and looked up, as if to measure the horizon. The board's decision had an effect that extended beyond documents. It attempted to cage the human moment with bureaucracy. Marcus sought out Victoria in her office to plead for the small pathway that had opened between them. They had a conversation that read like a negotiation between two different kinds of responsibility. The legal and public battle that followed became a test not only of the company's policies, but of the broader question of who gets to decide how care looks. The hearing was scheduled in a municipal room where the light came through blinds and the air smelled of old coffee and paper. Journalists filled the back like a second audience, cameras lined up like quiet sentinels. Marcus sat with Jonah on his lap because that was what made the most sense to him. Victoria arrived with Robert Chen and a legal team who had prepared statements and charts demonstrating governance models and risk assessments. Meanwhile, parents and advocates gathered in support, carrying handmade signs that read in penmanship both urgent and tender. On the other side, there were consultants who argued for standardization, for protocols, and for the avoidance of ad hoc interventions. The hearing included testimony from specialists who spoke in a formal cadence about evidence-based practices. And then there were those who bore witness to human things that did not always fit in a study. Marcus gave his testimony not as a professional expert, but as a living witness to the changes he had watched happen in Mia. The exchanges on the stand felt like a chorus of different logics. He recounted the sessions with simplicity, offering the story of bubbles, the evening at the dinner table, the way Mia had allowed a paper bird to cross from one hand to another. He said, sometimes being small is enough. Sometimes being present is the method. The room held its breath like a body listening for a heartbeat. There were moments during the hearing that reached real intensity, moments that would later read like the hinge of the story. One such moment was when a clinical psychologist, Dr. Billionaire, spoke with clinical authority and empathy about the difference between technique and holding a space. She described how small gestures can sometimes catalyze larger engagement, how presence reduces threat response. Another moment came when a public relations consultant, Daniel Reeves, argued that the company could expand its community work and formalize Marcus's role into a family outreach coordinator, bridging the human and the institutional. A tense exchange occurred when an opposing lawyer questioned Marcus's motives, implying negligence. Marcus, shaking but steady, answered with details that could not be refuted. He described the sounds Mia made when she calmed, the weight of her head against his shoulder like a sealed agreement, the way Jonah laughed when Mia gave him a crayon lion on a napkin. The testimony was not only about Mia, but about a culture that needed to learn the full vocabulary of care. The judge, who had watched the proceedings with a face that suggested both compassion and a careful ledger, ultimately made a decision. That was neither a sweeping victory nor a total defeat. The ruling allowed Marcus to continue his limited interactions with Mia under a structured oversight plan that included training sessions, documented sessions, and a supervised schedule. The company agreed to fund research into community-based approaches and to pilot a program that would be evaluated by an independent board. It was a compromise, a patchwork repair that felt like a victory because it preserved the human tenuously, but it also imposed a structure that smelled of antiseptic. The press had a field day with headlines that alternated between sentiment and skepticism. Victoria, who had voted with the board at times and against it at others, walked out of the courtroom with Marcus and Jonah, the sunlight carving them in high contrast. She looked at Marcus with something like gratitude. "You made me see another way," she said quietly. Marcus wiped his hand on his pants and smiled. "You had to let a bubble show you the sky," he said. After the hearing, the company allocated resources toward creating a community center built from the adjacency between corporate capital and neighborhood need. Marcus began to work on the early planning committees despite having no formal title. Architects visited the space that Victoria had donated near the corporate campus, and sketches began to appear in meetings where Jonah colored crayons across the margins. The project was proposed as the Blue Room Initiative, a series of safe spaces for children with sensory needs and for families who lacked access to consistent support. Sarah Alvarez organized volunteer days. Robert Chen oversaw legal frameworks for privacy and safety. Elena Park created messaging that balanced compassion and accountability. Thomas Briggs managed budget spreadsheets with the kind of fierce precision he used to guard the company against risk. Neighborhood leaders such as Rosa Jimenez, who ran the community nursery, and Pastor Michael, who worked on local outreach, were brought in to advise. Manny Ortiz, Marcus's co-worker and friend from the building, recommended flooring materials that babbled noise and felt warm to the touch. Priya Nair consulted on staff training and recommended occupational therapists and sensory-friendly furniture. The planning meetings were a mix of clinical notes, paint samples, and heartfelt anecdotes. Blue paint chips were placed beside upholstery swatches, and someone always insisted on adding plants that smelled like the neighborhood. The design of the center leaned into sensory possibility. There would be a quiet room with dimmable lights and gentle fiber optic curtains that drape like waterfalls. A kitchen for shared meals, where children could learn to eat without pressure. An art studio stocked with crayons and big sheets of paper. And a garden where small hands could dig in the soil. The architects suggested rounded corners and textured walls that invited touch. The council debated whether to include a legal office or a parent resource room. Marcus advocated for a corner for fathers who needed conversation, a place where men like him could bring coffee and share the unglamorous truth of caregiving. The construction process became a community ritual, with volunteers sanding floorboards and families painting murals with the children. The physical labor carried the smell of sawdust and paint and the sound of laughter mixing with the hum of drills. Each hammer strike sounded like a punctuation mark in a story being written by more than one hand. The inaugural day of the Blue Room Initiative was a soft sunlight morning that tasted of citrine and mint. The ribbon was not a formal ribbon, but a long blue scarf that children had tied in a chain. Mia came with Victoria, Jonah came with Marcus, and a crowd threaded between both expectation and tenderness. 5 to 8 people who had been named through the process were present in roles that mattered concretely. Rosa Jimenez led an activity table that smelled of glue and crushed strawberry. Pastor Michael blessed the space without invoking doctrine, in a way that was inclusive rather than directive. Elena Park worked the microphone with practiced ease while explaining the center's mission. Robert Chen read safety guidelines with a legislator's steady cadence, and Manny organized a toolkit corner for volunteers. There were also parents like Aisha, who brought along twins and who had been on a waiting list for months, and Luis, a local teacher who had been advocating for inclusive classrooms for years. The day unfolded in micro-scenes, full of the textures of ordinary life. Paper boats were floated in a shallow tray, crayons left marks on palms, and children learned how to take turns without anyone shouting a rule. Security guard Derek wandered the perimeter with a lighter step, watching a scene he had once overseen with suspicion, now unspooled into trust. There were tensions even after opening. Not every person in the neighborhood felt immediately included. Some questioned whether corporate funding meant corporate control. Others worried about sustainability. The center had to navigate municipal permits, a budget that relied on both philanthropic gifts and community fundraising, and the fluctuating attention of public opinion. Champions from within the company continued to advocate, including Victoria, whose public image had been reshaped by the story of a janitor who had insisted on small things. She gave a speech at the opening that managed to be both corporate and human, a rare blend. "This is not about a gesture," she said. "It is about a commitment to create space where presence can flourish." The center began to measure success not only by attendance, but by small markers of well-being. A hand reaching out, a child attempting a new food, a father finding another father to speak with. Slowly, the Blue Room became a place where ordinary minutes added up into something that felt like progress. There were moments of tension that felt like storms and needed to be described with pressure and relief. One such moment occurred when a donor pulled back funding after a negative press cycle, causing layoffs for several staff members who had been hired for the project. The community had to scramble, reallocating volunteer hours and applying for emergency grants. Marcus and Manny organized shifts that meant Marcus slept fewer hours between his janitorial work and his commitments to the center. A second moment of strain came when a neighbor filed a complaint about noise, threatening to revoke a permit. The team had to pivot, instituting new schedules, building a sound buffer wall, and negotiating with city officials in meetings that smelled of municipal coffee and concern. A third moment of crisis happened when Mia had a public meltdown during a community picnic, and social media picked up a video that simplified the scene into a clickbait frame. The team responded by doubling down on transparency, offering open days and resources to explain their approach. In each case, the narrative demanded patience, a willingness to show the messy work of sustaining an idea and the steadiness of community networks. Each tension was addressed in steps of repair that were often as humble as extra shifts, meetings with neighbors over tea, and careful communication. As the months passed, the project accumulated stories that were both small and large. Marcus became a figure known across the city not because he sought recognition, but because his gestures were visible. He taught a class where fathers learned to fold paper boats, a ritual that children loved. Jonah became an unofficial mascot of the center, handing out crayons and reminding older kids to take off their shoes in the quiet room. Victoria learned to ask questions that were not about margins and profit, but about whether a space felt safe. She started attending support group meetings, listening more than speaking, and she wrote a check to seed a scholarship for families who could not afford sessions. The company developed a formal position, community liaison, and hired someone who had experience working with local families. Marcus was offered training and became part of the core staff. His duties formalized, but his practice remained essentially the same: presence, patience, small gestures. 1 month after opening, the Blue Room had welcomed 50 families. Records showed 30 children had participated in sensory play sessions and 10 fathers had attended support circles. There were measurable increases in parental confidence reported in surveys, and Mia had attended 3 structured sessions and 2 unstructured playtimes. At 3 months, the center had stabilized its volunteer roster, with more than 200 hours donated weekly by community members and corporate employees. Marcus had completed a basic training in therapeutic presence and had begun to mentor other staff members. The local press ran a feature that focused less on spectacle and more on mundane outcomes like routine, trust, and the ways small repeated acts accumulate. At 6 months, the Blue Room had expanded into a second room, installed a small kitchen for family meals, and begun a pilot program in partnership with the municipal school district to integrate sensory spaces in classrooms. Families reported decreased anxiety in children while entering school settings, and Mia had begun to use single words with increasing frequency in safe contexts. The epilogue of statistics and stories read like a ledger of careful growth, numbers that mattered because they reflected real households reorganizing their days and futures. The center had become a template that other neighborhoods began to study, and Victoria had started conversations with other corporations about investing not as branding but as partnership. Jonah had a book published in the center's newsletter titled Things That Are Blue that featured crayon illustrations and small essays about belonging. The final scenes braided together the voices of many people who had touched the project. Marcus sat on a bench in the garden with Jonah at his side, and Mia running a hand across the water of a shallow fountain. Victoria walked by, coffee in hand, and paused to greet a new family who had just arrived. Rosa organized a painting session nearby. Pastor Michael led a midday breathing circle that was open to all. Ethan, a young volunteer who had recently moved to the area, taught a music class that included rhythm-based accessibility practices. And Lisa, a social worker who had been part of the early triage, monitored sign-in sheets with a contented focus. The center hummed like a machine, designed around heartbeats rather than spreadsheets. There were still challenges: permit renewals and grant applications, sensor calibrations and maintenance, disagreements about programming, a need to keep listening. But the arc of the story had shifted. A janitor who was a single father had been an unlikely engine, not because of position, but because he knew the grammar of small presence. The conclusion drew the threads into a quiet series of lessons. Marcus had not invented a therapy. He had insisted on being human in places that had forgotten how to hold small things. Mia had not been cured in a miraculous cinematic arc. She had been offered patience and space, and she had expanded her vocabulary in degrees that mattered to those who loved her. Victoria had learned humility, not as a performative act, but as an ongoing practice. The institution had learned to bend around a human story, and to allow corporate resources to be used in a way that acknowledged chaos and potential. The piece closed with a reflection on the shape of care. What is required to make room for people was not only policy, but the willingness to be present without a script. If this story moved you, then share it with someone who might be inspired to create space where small things can grow. Subscribe to follow more stories where ordinary decisions lead to public change. Sometimes the most radical act is to sit on the floor and blow a bubble.